Good morning. Welcome to church this morning. We're really glad you're here. If you'd stand, we're going to get started. God is He's our everything, but I love to think about how He's our cornerstone. He's our foundation of who we are. He's our identity. He's where our hope is found. So let's just sing about that this morning. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest fame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest fame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love, and through the storm, He is Lord, He's Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. Sing it out. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love, and through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. 'Cause He is the Lord, He's Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love, and through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love, and through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, just in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. Oh, I'm so thankful for His righteousness this morning. Without His righteousness, we would just be lost. And He so freely gives it to us. Lord, we just worship You this morning for giving us that whiteness, that cleansing power that You have, and just pouring that over us, God. You're our way maker. When we think we've gone too far, you let us know that you can make a way and that you have answers, you have solutions. God, we thank you for that. And that you're here this morning with us. You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. And you are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. And you are here, touching every heart. I worship you. I worship you. And you are here, healing every heart. I worship you. I worship you. And you are here, turning lives around. And I worship you. I worship you. And you are here, mending every heart. I worship you. I worship you, Lord, 'cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Because you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. That is who you are. Oh, that is who you are. Yeah, that is who you are. That is who you are. And that is who you are. And that is who you are. That is who you are. That is who you are. 'Cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. God, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. And even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You know, singing that song, it's like we're saying to God, you are the waymaker. You're the one who solves our problems, our issues, our troubles, our struggles. We don't have to be struggling. We don't have to be the one who solves everything. We just have to take it to him. And I was looking at Psalm 141, and he calls out, "Oh Lord, I call to you, hasten to me." I mean, he's like, God, I'm calling on you, hurry up. He says, give ear to my voice when I call to you, and let my prayer be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice. And then he says, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. So he's even asking God to help him be careful what he says, because he doesn't want to say the wrong thing. And he says, but my eyes are toward you, O God, my Lord, in you I seek refuge. Leave me not defenseless. And I was at the Carolina football game last night, and you know how people are just so crazy at football games? They just get all excited, and they're like, yeah, you know, and people you never see move or say anything, all of a sudden they're like all over the place. I wish we could get that way about worship. I know it's hard to do, but in our hearts, at least, I hope we're like that. You know, I hope we're like the little kids who are just so excited that our dad has come into the room, and we can just run into his arms and know that we're safe there. And, you know, just the idea that we can come to him with every need and every problem and every struggle. And I know, like, the mornings I wake up and say, God, I need you, and I sing that song, you know, the one, Lord, I need you, I need you. Every day I need you, every hour I need you. Those are the good days, because I know that the Father in heaven is watching over me. He's putting the guard on my mouth. He's making a way where there doesn't seem to be a way. I just want us to pray together. God, I just pray that you just help us turn to you at every hour, every minute, and just know that you're there. We can be excited with you. We can be sad with you. We can be angry with someone. We can be angry at you and tell you, and that you know how to deal with that, God. You know how to help us get on the path that you have for us. So we're so thankful for that this morning. And Lord, you turn graves into gardens. You turn seas into highways. You make beauty from ashes. And God, I've seen it in my life over and over, and I know so many of us here have, that God just takes the worst circumstances and he turns it into something beautiful that we would never have imagined. And God, we thank you for that this morning. And we just want to praise you as we sing this next song about how you're able to take our weaknesses and turn them into strengths. In Jesus' name. Feel free to scream and holler. Get excited. I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. A man's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough. And then you came along, back together, and every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing better than you. There's nothing. God of the valley. And there's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than you. This is what God does. He does it in our lives. We just have to ask. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. And you turn seas into highways. And you're the only one who can. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. Thank you, Jesus. You're the only one who can. And you turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. And you're the only one who can. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than you. Let's sing it to him. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than you. Oh God, we're so thankful that we have you. Because what would we be without you in our lives? We would be without hope. God, I'm just so thankful we have hope. We can turn to you. We can come to you with all of our problems like a little kid, with all of the stuff in our hearts. Everything, all of our sadness, all of our anger, all of our struggles. And you hear us, God, because of the blood of Jesus, because your righteousness covers over it all. We just thank you and praise you this morning, and ask that you just give Kenny the words that you would have for him about how to come out of places where your whole world falls apart. Because God, you're with us in the valleys, and you're with us on the mountaintops too. In Jesus' name, amen.
Turn it back to you. Lord, we thank you for the resources that you've given to us, Lord. And thank you, Father, that we have this chance to give to your kingdom, to know, Lord, that you will use this for your honor and your glory. We trust that. We believe that. And so, Lord, may you be with the gift and the giver today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. First of all, I want to thank the good-looking guitar player that was up here. You're wondering who that is. That's my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law and my sister are with us today. We really appreciate them contributing to service. I have two announcements also to make you aware. First of all, I'm sure that many of you, I hope all of you are aware that we have a business meeting following the service, immediately following the service, and we do need a certain number, so we're hopeful that you can all stay. And even if you're not a member, if you'd like to participate, that's fine, but it will be a official business meeting to vote on some things we have before us. Also, I want to announce Camp Dixie Sunday will be October the 3rd, and that will include, first of all, we'll have Justin Perkins who will be with us. And he is the director of programming. I don't know what his official title is, but I know that he has just been hired at Camp Dixie. Justin will be with us. And also, we will have a fundraiser lunch that day, which I am told will be hot dogs, hamburgers, and this will be a chance for us to give to Camp Dixie, which is, if you're not aware, Camp Dixie is the camp that we help to support, along with many churches in our conference. And this is a youth camp that, well, it's not just youth. I know they also serve adults as well, but it's our camp in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It's been a blessing. Many in this room, their lives have been touched by Camp Dixie. And so we want to make you aware of that as well. So the business meeting and Camp Dixie Sunday on October the 3rd. I'd like to read, if you did bring a Bible or if you have your phone, I know it's a different era, if you look to Psalm 62. And I'd like to read this scripture for us this morning. This is by David, written by David, King David. And he writes this: "Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down? The leaning wall, this tottering fence, surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Surely the lowborn are but a breath. The highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing together. They are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken. Two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love, and you reward everyone according to what they have done." May God add a blessing to the reading of his word. Now, I've been a pastor for over 35 years, but during that time, I've also possessed a secret identity as a superhero. You've heard of Spider-Man, Iron Man, Batman. Well, you can call me Invulnerable Man. And what's my superpower? I'm invulnerable to injury, sickness, fear, failure, fatigue, and aging. At least that's what I thought. I initially thought that. But then reality struck, and I realized that I'm far from invulnerable man. For example, this supposed superhero has boundless energy to play tennis and to bike all around Wake and Johnson County. But the next day I'm like, Kim, can you can you tie my shoes because it's too painful to bend over? And you know what my loving wife will say to me? She'll say something like, well, is this what I get to look forward to? I've realized that this superhero got COVID. This superhero is petrified to fly. This superhero produces kidney stones like it's microwave popcorn. You get the picture. I am woefully lacking as a superhero. Now, the Nobel Prize-winning poet Czeslaw Milosz once wrote a 3-sentence poem which summarizes the struggle of all would-be invulnerable superheroes, and here it is. He writes, "To believe you are magnificent and gradually discover that you are not magnificent, enough labor for a lifetime." I've come to the place, and maybe you have as well, that every day, every single day, I'm reminded of my vulnerability. Now, the word vulnerable means to be woundable. How do you live with life's wounds? What do you do when you discover that your health or your dreams or your relationships or even your nation is much more fragile than you ever imagined? How do you react when life shakes the very foundation you thought you could stand upon? These are the very questions behind Psalm 62. Now, as I told you, Psalm 62 is written by King David, and David at the time was the closest thing to a real-life superhero. He's the shepherd boy who transformed into the giant-slaying, godly warrior king of Israel. Do you know, if David were alive today, he'd have his own superhero name. I thought about it. I asked a friend as well. What would be David's name today as a superhero? Super shepherd. We thought of that one. Or maybe even Slingshot. He'd have his own movie series. Do you realize that? Today, kids would bring their Super Shepherd lunchboxes to school and wear Super Shepherd their pajamas and underwear. Children would trick or treat wearing their Slingshot costumes. And who are you supposed to be? I'm Slingshot. Oh, I'd better duck. I don't want to get hit with a rock. And people would have logical debates about who would win between Super Shepherd and Batman or Slingshot and Spider-Man. But Bible commentators believe this, that when superhero David wrote this psalm, he was perhaps at the most vulnerable place in his entire life, because his life's foundation was crumbling beneath him. Well, what happened? Well, David was a superhero, godly warrior king, but also he was a negligent dad. He was a negligent dad. He loved his kids, and he was lax and inconsistent with disciplining them. And not only that, when they inevitably messed up, he was very slow to restore them. Now, this was David's kryptonite. Case in point, David had 19 kids. Did you know that? 19 kids, which might explain part of David's issues. As a parent, have you ever called out all your kids' names until you got the right one? Jimmy, Linda, Janet, Bobby, Danny, that's the one. Can you imagine that with 19 kids? So maybe David couldn't even keep their names straight, never mind disciplining them. But seriously, the problem is this, is that any family can experience a traumatic event, right? And that one event has the power to unite a family or tear it apart. In David's family, this was the traumatic event, an ancestral rape. David's oldest son, Amnon, forcibly raped his sister, his stepsister, Tamar. So how did David the father respond? Oh, he was furious. However, he did nothing to punish his son. Maybe it stirred up painful memories of his own sexual sin history with Bathsheba. But whatever the reason, it appears that David swept it under the rug. But there was someone else in the family who refused to ignore it, and that was Tamar's full brother and Amnon's stepbrother, Absalom. And 2 years later, Absalom plotted and executes his oldest son's murder, Amnon, and then he becomes a fugitive for 3 years. And in that time, the Bible tells us that David longed for his son Absalom, but he did nothing to reconnect with him. And eventually, Absalom made his way back to Jerusalem with David's full knowledge. But again, how does David respond? The Bible tells us that Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. And eventually, Absalom breaks the estrangement between he and his dad by initiating a meeting with his father where he says, even if it costs me my death, I'm going to do this thing. And so they finally meet and they reconcile with a kiss. But in Absalom's heart, the seed of rebellion was already planted. And it's caused in large part by his absentee father. So to make a long story short, Absalom stages a 4-year coup to steal the hearts of the Israelite people and to wrest the crown away from his own father. And as a result, David is eventually forced to flee his palace, to flee for his life with a remnant of his army still loyal to him. So when David writes Psalm 62, he's a king on the run, with his kingdom up for grabs and his own flesh and blood hunting him down like an animal. Do you know what it's like to stand in David's sandals? To stand amidst the carnage of your carefully constructed little kingdom that you thought was all together, feeling more vulnerable than you ever thought you could possibly feel. What did that look like for you? Maybe it was a phone call, just one phone call, which changed the trajectory of your entire life. Or maybe it was a doctor's visit. Or maybe it was a conversation that went south and hurtful words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. Or maybe, like David, you could trace the beginning of your kingdom collapse back to you, and the guilt was overwhelming. I was an absentee dad. I should have paid more attention to the needs of my wife. I should have gone to the doctor to check that lump. If I could do it over again, I would have never logged on to that website. I had to have my own way. I couldn't say I was sorry. I did withhold my love. I was a terrible dad. I was a terrible mother, a terrible friend, a terrible sibling, etc., etc. So what do you do, superhero, when your cape is lost and your kingdom is a pile of rubble and you're staggered by the raw vulnerability that you feel? What do you do with that? Well, what does David do? If you know David, if you know anything about David, and I know many of you do, you know that based upon what he writes in Psalm, the man had no qualms about airing out his feelings with God. Good, bad, or ugly, here it comes, God, unfiltered. So does he pray something like we would typically read in Psalms? Hear my cry, O God. Listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth, I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Save us and help us with your right hand, that those who you love may be delivered. Give us aid against the enemy, for the help of man is worthless. With God, we will gain the victory. Does he pray something like that? Here's the surprise of the psalm. Would you be surprised if I told you that David doesn't ask God for anything? Nothing. At his most vulnerable point, he doesn't ask for victory, doesn't ask for strength, doesn't ask for hope, wisdom. I want you to listen again or hear again God's words through David. Psalm 62. verses 1 through 2. Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. And then in verses 5 through 6, he says almost the exact same thing verbatim. Yes, my soul finds rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. Do you see what David is doing? He's proclaiming God's truth to himself. In other words, I want you to hear this. He's preaching. To who? To himself. He's preaching to himself. With God listening in. You say, well, I'm confused. You see, we tend to associate preaching with something we listen to, right? It's the job for the professional clergy. You listen to my sermon and maybe you greet me at the door and say, I enjoyed that message, Pastor. Or maybe you think to yourself, if it can't be said in 20 minutes, it shouldn't be said at all. Or maybe you watch a sermon on YouTube and you press the thumbs up or the thumbs down, whoever you're listening to. You know, I crunched some numbers this week, and just out of from my own curiosity. And if you come to church twice a month, over a year, that means you hear 26 sermons. If you do that for 10 years, that's 260. If you do that for 20 years, that's 460. You do it for 40 years, you've heard 1,040 sermons. If you hear one sermon a week, you know how many you hear in 40 years? 2,080 sermons. Some of you in this room have heard more sermons than a seminary preaching professor. Do you realize that? You've heard some inspiring sermons that have brought you into the heavens, and you might say that you've heard some others that were absolute to listen to. Let me share something important that maybe you've never, ever thought of. The best sermons you will ever hear preached will not come from me or any other pastor. The best sermons you'll ever hear preached will be the sermons you preach to you. Those are the best. Joe Thorne wrote a book entitled Note to Self. To preach to yourself is to challenge yourself, push yourself, point yourself to the truth. It is not so much uncovering new truth as much as it is reminding yourself of the truth you tend to forget. Let me tell you what preaching is at its core, and I think Joe Pritchett would agree with me. Joe's in the crowd. Preaching is simply proclaiming God's truth. You don't have to be a clergy, you don't have to be a preacher to proclaim God's truth to your own heart, where you are the illustration, you are the object lesson. Where if you're going to bore anybody, it will be you boring you. So in his most vulnerable state, with his world caving in, David realizes what I need more than anything else in my life right now is a sermon to myself. I need to challenge myself, point myself to God's truth. My soul finds rest in God alone. That's the message for me. Is that a sermon that you need to preach to yourself today? Do you remember the name Kayla Mueller? Let me put her picture. I think we might have it. Put her picture up there. Do you remember her? Kayla was a Christian humanitarian aid worker who was captured by ISIS forces in 2015. And for the next 18 months, she was held hostage and repeatedly abused in every way imaginable until she was executed. In her last letter that she wrote, which her parents received, she wrote this paragraph that I'd like to read to you. She writes, I remember Mom always telling me that all in all, in the end, the only one you have is God. I have come to a place in my experience where in every sense of the word, I have surrendered myself to my Creator because literally there was no one else. And then she adds this sentence. By God and by your prayers, I have felt tenderly cradled in free fall. Can you think of a better way to describe what it means to find your soul rest in God alone? My life can be in free fall, but I am tenderly cradled by God. That'll preach. And that's the sermon David preaches to himself. Hey, David, you know that life is fragile, but remember, God alone is your soul rest. But David doesn't end there, because every great sermon has to have 3 points, right? And David goes on to preach to himself the 3 reasons as to why God is his only rest. And he does this really quickly, and I will as well. He said, he is my salvation, he's my rock, and he's my fortress. My salvation, my rock, and my fortress. David begins, he preaches, God is my salvation. In Hebrew, salvation means rescue. David is saying, God, you alone are my rescuer. God alone has the power to rescue me from sin, calamity, hopelessness, depression, disappointment, and my collapsing kingdom. Therefore, my hope isn't in armies, money, retirement portfolios, resumes, a quality education, a good woman, or a loving man. God is my rescuer. And David goes on to preach. God is my rock. God is my one constant in my life, which never changes despite whatever's happening in my life. He's my rock. He and his promises are eternal. I'd like to show you perhaps the most famous rock in New England outside of Plymouth Rock. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's a natural stone formation in New Hampshire that was discovered in 1886. Do you know what it's called? He's called the Old Man of the Mountain. But on May 3rd, 2003, people woke up to discover that the old man's face was gone. Weather and erosion weakened the stone formation of the face to the point where it collapsed and the old man's face fell off, gone forever. Is that not a picture of the rocks we seek refuge in this world? On the surface, they appear to be rock solid, but then life erodes them, and one day they're gone. Someone says, I can't believe they're divorcing. They seem so happy together. Well, what do you mean he went bankrupt? He was loaded. He retired at 35 years of age to enjoy life. What happened? Or he was a great ball player. Greatest ball player I ever saw, but he blew out his knees and his career is over. What a shame. And we realize there's only one rock which life can't erode, and that rock is God and his word. And lastly, David preaches, God is my fortress. God is my first line of defense. He's my protection. He's my safe haven. Therefore, my security and trust isn't based upon Blue Cross Blue Shield, pensions, security alarms, long-term care insurance, having a pet Rottweiler. My trust and security is found only in God. So what's the result of trusting in God as my salvation and my rock and my fortress? Well, David says, I will never be shaken. And David has come to the most important conclusion in his sermon. I might be at an incredibly vulnerable place in my life, but in God I have found my rest because he is my salvation and my rock and my fortress. I don't have to be a superhero because in him I will not be shaken. Isaiah 30:15, in repentance and rest is your salvation, and quietness and trust is your strength. My oldest son, I'm going to close with this. My oldest son, Kelly, pointed me to a show not too long ago. And he said, Dad, you'll love this show. It's not a Christian show, but I think you'll really, really enjoy it. It's called Ted Lasso. And it is a secular show, but I see powerful Christian truths embodied in the show, like forgiveness and kindness and compassion. The premise of the show is an American football coach who was hired to coach English football, which is soccer. And that's two different sports right there. And one of the main characters is a player on the team by the name of Jamie Tartt. And Jamie Tartt he's a superstar of that team. He is the one star, but he's cocky. And he's arrogant. And he's self-centered. He refuses to embrace any concept of team play. However, during the season, Jamie suffers some personal setbacks which begin to erode the veneer of his cockiness and selfishness. You begin to see cracks of vulnerability in him. And you also begin to see the root of his issues. Jamie Tartt has an abusive, domineering father who, behind the scenes, unmercifully drives him through every means possible, including physical and emotional abuse. And in the biggest game of the season, attended by Jamie Tartt's dad, the team loses 5-0, which for international soccer is the equivalent of losing 75-0 in American football. And so following the game, the TV pans the locker room, and it's like a morgue. Players are quiet and solemn. Coaches are the same way. But all of a sudden, in the midst of that quietness and solemnness, Jamie Tartt's half-drunk father comes bursting into the locker room. And he immediately begins berating his own son in front of the team. And he berates the entire team. And Jamie's embarrassed. But he tries to softly rebuff his dad's insults. But when his dad shoves him to get his attention, years of stifled anger and pain erupt to the surface, and with one punch, he knocks his father to the ground. And before Dad can retaliate, he's forcibly removed from the locker room, kicking and screaming and yelling at his son. And at that moment, Jamie stands motionless in an eerily silent locker room like this. And you realize that this once cocky superstar has now become a broken, grieving, exposed mass of vulnerability. It's like that for 10 or 15 seconds. And in the midst of this awkward silence, one man, an assistant coach and former teammate who once despised Jamie Tartt, chooses to walk over to him and embrace him. And when he does that, something breaks in Jamie. The dam breaks. And in front of all of his teammates and coaches, he weeps bitterly. These wrenching sobs that bubble to the surface. I watched that scene, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that I wept. And here's the reason why. As I watched that, I thought, isn't that what Jesus does in our lives? When we're at our weakest, most vulnerable place, God incarnate, Jesus, meets us there. And in his own words, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." I am your soul rest. So I would say to you, every superhero, would-be superhero in this room, do you need a soul rest? Are you feeling vulnerable today? for whatever reason, the cracks of vulnerability that you sense. If you do, it's time to do some preaching to yourself. It's time to remind yourself that my soul finds rest in God alone. For He alone is my salvation. He alone is my rock. He alone is my fortress. And because of these things, I will not be shaken. Let's pray. Father God, we have enough life experience in this room, Lord, that we know this. We know that life can cause the very life foundation that we hold to, our little kingdoms, to collapse. We can find ourselves, Lord, at a place where we just feel raw vulnerability. Lord, how did it come to this? And Lord, when you led me to preach this message, Lord, I didn't think of any one individual. But Lord, I have to believe there are people here today that are at a place of vulnerability. Maybe their carefully constructed little kingdom is collapsing or cracking, and Lord, they're feeling vulnerable, just like David. And Father, I pray that like David, we would preach a message to ourselves, a message of truth. And that is that you are our only soul rest. Because you are my salvation and my rock and my fortress. I will trust in you, and I will not be shaken. Lord, speak to the hearts of your people by your sweet Holy Spirit. And may you do the work in their spirits that only you can do. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please stand.
A wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. A wonderful Savior to me. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, where rivers of pleasure I see. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. A wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. He taketh my burden away. He holdeth me up, and I shall not be moved. He giveth me strength as my day. He His hand.
I'd like to remind you of the business meeting, again, following the service. And I'd like to ask my friend and once pastor of this church, Joe Pritchett. Joe, if you would close us today in prayer.